Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode of Finneran's Wake. I'm joined today by Professor Mark Schrad. Mark Schrad is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Villanova University in our country's first capital, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at which our illustrious founding fathers convened so long ago. He's the director of Russian Area Studies at that distinguished Roman Catholic institution, equally marked for its religious piety and basketball prowess. He earned his PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and has since published 3 books, all by Oxford University Press, to which I'll include links in the show notes below. The Political Power of Bad Ideas, Vodka Politics, whose name I just love, and his latest work, across which I had the good fortune to stumble during my latest trip to Barnes & Noble, Smashing the Liquor Machine. Mark, thank you so much for agreeing to join me today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Oh, I think it will be loads of fun. So I wanted to begin first with some domestic news. Now, I know this isn't your formal area of academic expertise, but as someone in possession of a PhD in political science, who's a resident of the pivotal Keystone state of Pennsylvania, in which one of the most compelling and unusual Senate races occurred, I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about the results of this midterm election from which we're but a day removed.
Yeah, what do you want to talk about? I mean, I've got my own, sort of my own partisan slant on it, but also, trying to study things objectively in terms of, some of these different elements. I guess in terms of, I guess my own personal politics, there was some relief when it came to, not only the Senate race, but also the governor's race, because I think that would impact us more directly. I'm grateful, in particular, that Shapiro won the governorship, because some of the stuff that Mastriano was putting out there, utterly toxic. Especially when you've got friends and family members, in the LGBTQ community, that have been roundly vilified and attacked. We were suggesting that we probably couldn't stand 4 years of that coming from the governor's office in particular. And so, I think that was kind of a big sigh of relief for us there. More to the point, more, I guess, from more of an objective position, and this is something I talked about with my students today in class, is that, a couple days ago, like on social media, I found this this video investigation of, it was on CNN.com, of these election monitors, right, who were being trained up, and a lot of it is based on sort of conspiracy theories, that the elections were stolen, and this whole thing is rigged, and on all this. And I was, watching this video, very, very interesting, kind of back and forth. And I started looking, and I'm like, okay, this is Pennsylvania, so that's kind of hits close to home. And then I looked a little bit closer, and the guy in the video says, it says Radnor Democrats. Well, that's our area around here, or not Radnor Democrats, Radnor Republicans. And then I was looking at the video, and they were shooting the CNN video in the park across the street from our house. And I'm like, oh my God, this is happening right here. This isn't some abstract thing that's way out in the ether. This is right in the middle of it all. And that was all interesting and kind of in its own right. But then when I voted yesterday, as we were going in, my wife and I were going in to vote, and I looked over, and outside the election, our little precinct, was that same guy from the CNN video. And I was like, I got to talk to that guy, because I want to figure out, because again, just thinking of this in sort of the objective study of politics, sort of my own, partisan beliefs aside, this is fascinating to me. This is somebody. And so we went and we voted on, and she went kind of on her way. She's like, I don't want any part of this, because who knows what could come out of this, right? So, but I went up and talked to him, and I'm like, hey, you're that guy from that CNN interview, right? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, so I wanted to know all about him. I wanted to know like what motivated him to do this, what motivated him to do, a CNN interview when nobody else would. I wanted to know like how, what the fallout was like for him, and so he was saying he got death threats and all sorts of, stuff was going on. And all these people calling me up out of the blue and telling me that I'm crazy. And he's like, you probably think I'm crazy too. And I'm like, I don't think you're crazy. I might disagree with your politics, but I'm fascinated by, your own motivations and what motivates you to get involved in politics and sort of the way that it comes about. So we had a very nice kind of pleasant conversation with this, this kind of election denier who was watching the polls, and it seemed to turn out for the best, because I do think that's one thing we have to get back to, is like engaging with each other, not vilifying, but sort of building bonds of familiarity and building bonds of trust. And I think the more that we do that, the further we get away from death threats and it's my way or the highway. Trying to find some common ground, even when the stakes are very, very far apart.
Yeah, no, and that's a very laudable approach to a man of that inclination. It seems as though these death threats are almost de rigueur. Everybody is being inundated with them for the mere sin of simply disagreeing or having a different idea or opinion. No, so that's an interesting experience you had, and of course the fact that he was willing to speak with you and you with him certainly is encouraging. Now, do you think relaying that message, that story to your students, do you think they would respond in a similar way, or do you think that there's a significant generational gap between maybe the 20-year-old student whom you're teaching and someone in your own age group or that of your wife who might approach these more amicable, cordial, well, maybe not cordial, but at least more amicable conversations in a more civilized way? Do you see the younger generations to whom you're instructing, do you see them maybe having that same ability that you displayed on that day?
Oh, I think it's just a natural curiosity, is more the motivation. I wouldn't know, what students would go in and, try to, I'm sure there's some people who would want to sort of, have somebody who might be their partisan opponent and would want to, I don't know, make a TikTok or an Instagram video or something and just like dunk on them, right? And just make it like a zero-sum game that I'm going to win and you're going to lose, and I'm going to put it on social media or something like that. But I do think, there's a lot more grace out there than we like to suggest, right? That people are willing to, once you get sort of beyond the screens that we're all used to staring into, and sort of conducting things and getting back to sort of face-to-face interactions. I think people are much more amicable and tend to be much more pleasant in that way. At least I hope so. Knock on wood. So
Yeah, it's such a, I don't know, a hackneyed idea at this point that the disconnect between people is probably one of the main causes of our well, what feels to be our unraveling as a society. But yeah, I think as soon as you walk up to someone, even if he's an election denier or what have you, and actually look into his eyes and have a conversation, and just out of mere curiosity, I think nothing bad from that can happen in most cases. I think that's always constructive. So you spoke about the governor's race. I think that was by and large a foregone conclusion. I know that you said that you sighed there was a sigh of relief for his victory, for his winning, but I was watching very closely, as I think most of America was, the Senate race between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz. So maybe you can remark on that for a little while. Did you expect the outcome that seems to be the case?
I kind of had, right, and so I just kind of keeping an eye on sort of not only polls but different degrees of civic participation. Over the months, because this has been going on for what, 9 months. We've been living through $375 million worth of advertising kind of dumped into our laps, and so it seems to have been going on for a long time. And you could kind of tell the degree to which there was, varying degrees of enthusiasm between the different candidates. But in recent weeks, the polling had tightened quite a bit, and so there was, I think, some concern. And my personal thought was that it was just going to get boiled down to, like it was in 2020, right? That it is going to come down to absentee ballots, mail-in ballots, because Pennsylvania is notoriously slow with this, because they can't legally begin counting ballots until election day, even if the ones that have been mailed in. And so I wasn't expecting to hear, to get a firm verdict one way or the other until Wednesday, maybe Thursday. So the idea that it was clear enough that they could call both races, both the governor's race and the Senate race, even late last night, I thought was, that was kind of significant in its own right.
Is there any, maybe you don't know this, but is there any initiative in the Pennsylvania legislature to amend this frustratingly slow electoral process? For example, I'm living in Florida at the moment, and since of course, the very controversial and fraught election of 2000, the Florida electoral process has been encouragingly smooth and actually quite fast. Of course, they're counting early votes as they come in, and usually within an hour or two on the evening of election day, they have their results and they're out there. Whereas Pennsylvania just seems to be a bit of a mess when it comes to this.
Yeah.
Do you know? I mean, do you know if there are any initiatives being taken to smooth out that process?
Yeah, there had been for a while, but one of the interesting things, and this has kind of got clarified today, as it turns out, it looks like the state house is actually flipped from red to blue, which nobody really saw that coming. And so, a lot of the initiatives to try to deal with electoral reform had been stalled because you had, the Pennsylvania State House was reliably red, and they were, reliably in terms of, sort of restricting voting as much as possible, slowing down the process. And so, I think I hope that with a new legislature, you might end up seeing a little bit more movement in that direction. Hopefully soon.
Oh yeah, one could hope. Certainly before 2024, where I'm sure Pennsylvania will be focused on with heightened scrutiny as it has been in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some conspiratorial rumors looking into the future that perhaps a Democrat governor of Pennsylvania might, with the, let's say, premature retirement of a man like John Fetterman because of medical issues, might then put forth a candidate, or a senator to replace him. I actually was just listening to a right-wing talk show radio host this morning describing this type of a plan. What do you think about that?
I hadn't heard that one before. So, I mean, it's plausible. Well, obviously a lot of things are plausible, but I can't imagine that, Fetterman's, I think obviously he has to keep an eye on his health, but I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he's kind of actually one of the more rising stars in the party. And so, we'll see how it plays out with his, kind of post-stroke health, but yeah, I don't imagine him retiring anytime soon.
Yeah, and it did seem to me to be a somewhat unlikely scenario that could play itself out. I suppose it's conceivable, but perhaps less likely. So with that, maybe you could just give a brief statement on the more general response of these results across the nation. Of course, we were expecting a red wave, a red tsunami that turned into a red trickle in a otherwise unstirred body of water. So, your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's unusual in its own right, because again, I'm sure the general trajectories are that, especially for a first term, um, you know, presidents, the midterm elections usually are shellacking, right? And so that was kind of the expectation. Um, and so, yeah, it seems like, by all measures, the Biden, administration has had the best midterm, outcome over the last, 20, 30 years or so.
Yeah, and I think a
So,
lot of people are surprised by that.
mhm,
How do you account for that? Because of course Biden's approval rating is not particularly high. So how do you
yeah.
account for that sort of a result?
Oh, I think women are motivated, especially in with the Dobbs decision. Putting reproductive rights not just as a as an abstract concept that could be rolled back, but as a frontline issue right there. So between, I think, women's rights and sort of just protection of democracy as a again, a sort of a frontline issue, even despite these the headwinds they were facing, not only in terms of just the general sort of institutional kind of blowback that you usually get with midterm elections, but also with the inflation and those issues as well. So I think the focus on that, it's not just economics, it's these other issues that are motivating people to get out, especially young people, younger women in particular. I think are sort of the story of the day, as at least based upon what I've seen at this point.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think throughout the course of the summer, the influence of the Dobbs decision, repeal of Roe v. Wade, on the electorate was perhaps um, front heavy. Like the expectation was in May and in June that this would be a pivotal issue on which a
Hmm.
lot of voters would be deciding. But as the summer progressed, as we got into the fall, as the economy looked bleaker and bleaker, and as the inflation numbers rose higher and higher, I think a lot of people, a lot of pundits were beginning to realize that perhaps reproductive health, the issue of abortion, would probably be less important, less integral in people's selections of candidates. Perhaps it was not, though, and that's an interesting point that you make on that matter.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's certainly germane, right? It's certainly a very important topic, and I think those people who were kind of discounting that, especially as time goes on from the summer to the fall, kind of did that at their own peril. So,
Yeah, yeah, but it certainly is a surprising outcome. Um,
mhm.
I want to move from American politics to international politics. You are a political scientist, of course, and director of the Russian area of studies. So, the event of the decade about which we seem to have forgotten is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So maybe you can refresh our collective memory. What happened there? What is the situation at present? And where do you, as a close examiner of this conflict, where do you see it going?
Oh gosh, my own advisor back in the day was a demographer, and he always said, when it comes to predictions, he always reminded me that in Dante's Inferno, there's a certain circle of hell that's reserved for falsifiers and prognosticators who always they have their heads ripped around backwards, who are always looking back at their false projections. So I always try to get step aside
What
or
level
kind of.
what level of hell would that be?
I think it was the eighth circle.
I think
Is
that's pretty
eight.
close to the last. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's pretty far down there. One of
So
the
you're
sub
getting
circles.
you're getting close to Judas and Brutus and was it
Hmm.
Cassius?
Oh yeah, it's been a while, but the the whole thing with sort of Virgil kind of taking him down there, I think was very 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 interesting. But I guess when it comes to Ukraine, how much time do you have? We could talk about this for for weeks. So having some notion of Obviously, the Russian invasion, you can argue that that started back in 2014. I think we kind of focus on what happened back in February with the sort of full scale invasion, but really it's been an outright war since 2014. They just kind of escalated it quite a bit, in February. Obviously, the plans that the Russians had weren't realistic. The idea that they would move into Kyiv in 3 days and topple the government, and obviously the Ukrainians have been putting up quite a fight, and now it appears that I guess the announcement today is that the Russian forces are pulling back from the right bank of the Dnieper River and leaving Kherson region, which is a huge strategic change here in the last couple weeks. But this big announcement is pretty significant, right? And so it seems to be sort of the gradual pullback of these forces, even after sort of a mass mobilization of 300,000 Russian civilians. So yeah, it's not going well for the Russian side, and what comes of that, how this looks in the future. There are calls for the ever-present calls for mediation and negotiation. If anything comes of that, I don't know. It does seem like the Ukrainians are not only on the offensive, but not exactly willing to negotiate, because a lot of the things that um, you know that not only the Russian side, but sort of international side and sort of American realists and international relations scholars see as being talk about negotiating. Well, maybe have a demilitarized Donbass region, or give Putin these sorts of things to get him to the negotiating table. A lot of that stuff's not negotiable for the Ukrainian side, so I don't see this necessarily ending anytime soon. Could, again, don't want to end up with my head twisted around backwards, but this could be in for a long slog. And what happens during the winter, nothing good comes with Russian winters and Ukrainian winters. So I think we'll just have to kind of wait and see how it unfolds at that point.
Yeah, I think perhaps a consequence of our short attention spans and our attachment to Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and Reels and Shorts, we are experiencing everything on such short timelines. Like, the way I look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict is sort of what could be very early on in the contest, being not quite a year old. And you, as a scholar of Russia and its history, know better than anyone that this isn't a population, and this current regime isn't one that's averse to long commitments and wars of attrition that could last years. So I suppose that's my fear, is that this just continues on and almost
Mhm.
in perpetuity.
Yeah, at some point they're going to run out of arms. So I mean, some of the stuff that, especially on the Russian side, that they've been mobilizing. You're starting to see sort of these antiques that should be in museums, that they're starting to pop up on the front line. So you're starting to see, wares, these military, sort of these frontline like machine guns that were used during World War I. Are suddenly popping up, and so like you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. And so at some point you're just going to run out of sort of basic munitions. And so we'll see when that happens. That's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, and I suppose so long as there's a continuous influx of Western materials to the Ukrainians, then that fight can be sustained. Uh, do you think that the Ukrainians were wisely intransigent throughout this process? Because I think a lot of realists, as you call them,
Mhm.
were hoping that a negotiated peace of some sort could be put forth and accepted. But now, standing where we are, seeing that the areas in the eastern part of Ukraine that once looked to be firmly in Russian control might be more tenuously held now.
Mhm.
Do you think it was provident of them to continue on with the fight and perhaps what you might call a counteroffensive at this point?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's of course, again, it's not for me as some guy sitting in Pennsylvania to pass judgment on this. I mean, if they're in a fight for their lives, right? They're in a fight for the existence of their country, and so as as sort of a pacifist and sort of Tolstoyan as I can be, on the one side, it's hard not to recognize the fact that they're fighting in self-defense and trying to retake those territories that are that have been lost to them. And so trying to move out the aggressor isn't necessarily in itself an act of aggression in that same way. So yeah, I mean they're going to do what they're going to do, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, and hopefully what they're going to do, at least what the Ukrainians are going to do, is to succeed in some way, and hopefully to bring this bloodshed to an end.
Mhm.
So with that, I want to turn now to the topic of at least your last two books, maybe the first as well,
Yeah,
uh,
it's all there.
which
It's
is
all just kind of lumped together.
which is alcohol, one of our favorite beverages and pastimes. So it's clearly a topic to which you've devoted much of your popular and I would assume academic work as well.
Mhm.
So was it your focus on Russia and Russian history that led you to a deeper examination of the role that alcohol played in the empire, or maybe in financing the empire, or was were you more of a liquor enthusiast with an unslakable historical interest? So, what compelled
Yeah.
you to research and write about alcohol in this way?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit of both, right? So uh, I was always fascinated. Well, I guess I grew up in the Midwest, right? And I remember one of my formative memories was, I grew up in Davenport, Iowa, which is right along the Mississippi River. It's home to things like, International Harvester, J.I. Case, John Deere. They all have their headquarters there. And back during the old Cold War days, when I was a little kid, in the 80s, we had these exchange programs, right? So we'd send Americans to the Soviet Union and they would check things out, these goodwill ambassadors, and Soviets would send delegations, to the United States. And so they would send these delegates around and they'd send them to, places like Iowa, and they'd say, let's see how they do agriculture, right? So we'll go out and tour the farms and fields, and then they'll do, they tour the sort of the agribusiness and tour like John Deere, International Harvester. But then they would also tour like, show them what like an American school looks like, and they would always come to our school, right? It's at least that's what it seems. So we'd have the principal get on the loudspeaker, like when I was in elementary school. They say, kids, everybody be on your best behavior. The Soviet delegation is here, and I was like, okay, well, the president is out there calling these guys the evil empire, so obviously they must have horns coming out of their heads, and but they turned out to be like the nicest people I'd ever met. And so I think maybe that was kind of the kernel to a lot of this thing. It was this idea of, okay, well, you know why am I being told that these are horrible, horrible people, but my own senses are telling me the exact opposite, right? So I think that's kind of where a lot of this comes from, like the fascination with Russia. And
Don't you know, or didn't you know, not to believe your eyes, but to believe and trust in the propaganda?
oh
You
yeah,
weren't
yeah,
taught that?
exactly. But I'm absolutely fascinated nowadays by all the places that were like verboten in the 1980s, right? And so, I would love to go sometime to Libya. I'd love to go to, to Iran. These are the places that were like off limits. Just endlessly fascinating. I have no, background in any of these areas. I just want to go there, right? And I think that that's the same sort of route. Like the people who were the villains, that was part of it. And then when it comes to, I guess the more recent book, when you're talking about like temperance activists, if you look at American history, the temperance activists are portrayed as America's villains, right? Those are the people who are the Bible thumpers who are going to take away your freedom to drink and all this. And I'm like, I don't know, is that really what was going on? And I think maybe sort of the common thread between not only American politics and history, but also the Russian side, is that focus on who it is that we vilify and why do we do that, right? Collectively speaking. So, I think that's kind of the common thread that unites these things. But yeah, so I started going, that was the interest. And when I started going to, learning about Russia and going there and living there, and you do hear that stereotype of the drunken Russian, for a long time, and there's more to it than just a stereotype, right? And so you go there and it's like it becomes a professional hazard. If you go to Russia, you're expected to drink. Maybe not as a foreigner, they kind of let you off a little bit. And so recognize that you're probably not going to hold as much liquor as they are, um, especially when it comes to vodka. But the expectation is that if you want to get to know people and to open doors, there's no better way than doing it over a bottle of vodka, right? And so once you start to drink with people, they kind of open up and um, become more personable, right? And excuse me. So yeah, I think that was kind of the focus. But also, from sort of an academic focus, I wanted to you know, take that seriously, right? And say, okay, so why is it this way? Why is it that Russians drink so much vodka? That was kind of the focus, the motivation for the vodka politics book. And usually, like, the explanation is, oh, it's culture, it's history, and I think culture, the hand waving as part of that, right? Is I think we just kind of toss off into culture as this residual explanatory category for when we can't come up with a better explanation. So it's like, oh, whatever, it's just culture, right? And it's like, no, I think there's actually something more to it. And sort of the thesis of the vodka politics book is that it's not just about culture, but it's, Russians drink vodka because of generations and generations of political and economic decisions that are at the heart of sort of imperial and authoritarian statecraft, to put the interests of the state and state finances in particular over the well-being of the population, over the health, promotion in that sort of way. And so that was certainly something that had informed a lot of my interest in sort of the alcohol politics area, both in Russia and then as it kind of expands outward from Russia in the newer book on smashing the liquor machine.
Do you think that vodka and alcohol are unduly synonymous with the Russian citizenry? I bear an Irish last name, and of course, the Irish are often equated with their tendency to imbibe. It seems like in every culture there is, when you're looking at them derisively from the outside, there is some link to be made between the people, the culture, and its tendency to drink. So I guess among the peoples of the world, do you think it's, like I said, inappropriately applied to the Russians? Do you think it also could be equally applied to all?
I think there are variations, right? And of course it's hard to just kind of take an overall culture and break it down. It gets into some um, sort of logical empirical flaws, like when you're sort of fallacies of division and composition. So just to say that an entire culture has a particular trait does not obviously mean that every individual has that trait. And the yeah, I guess the inverse is true as well, right? So if you have individuals who are prone to alcohol consumption or alcoholism, that doesn't necessarily expand to sort of a broader cultural trait. But yeah, you have variation across different cultures, and that for me is fascinating, right? So why do you have these legacy of alcoholism in some cases, and more societal alcoholism in some areas, and not so much others? Um, you know, Ireland is a fascinating case. I've got chapter 5 in the more recent book has a lot to do with sort of Irish history. And what was fascinating to me, given that that kind of stereotype that we have of the drunken Paddy and Ireland and so on, was that that there is a predisposition towards alcoholism. But what's also fascinating is that if you go back to the 1840s, 50s, 60s, that was the Irish were probably the most temperate people on earth if you want to judge by sort of membership in sort of temperance organizations. You had the Father Theobald Matthew and his, from Cork, and he ended up sort of delivering this temperance pledge to people throughout Ireland, to the point where somewhere around 2/3 of all Irishmen were, let's say, card carrying. They had medals, right? So medal carrying members of this temperance league, and so that kind of blows up a lot of the stereotypes that we have when it comes to sort of these histories of alcohol and alcohol consumption.
Yeah, it really does, and I'd much prefer to have a medal to a card, a mere card.
Mhm. Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah,
I keep
yeah,
looking for one, like on eBay or any place. I would see if I can find a Father Matthew temperance medal, but to this point,
I
have not found one yet.
I would wield that with such pride as I walked around an otherwise intemperate town.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, and that's fascinating, and the um, connection of some of these peoples with drink, I think, is sometimes, like you said, um, maybe overdetermined, and certainly commits a lot of fallacies in that regard. Now, there was, of course, a utilitarian purpose of alcohol in these empires, and that was to raise revenue for the state. Now, that's one of the things that I found most interesting in your latest book. You talk about the fact that in some cases, up to 1/4, 25% of a state's revenue would be coming from the imposition of taxes on liquor, on alcohol. So let me ask you, why is alcohol, of all possible commodities on which you can raise revenue, why is alcohol particularly suitable?
Hmm. Yeah, it's and that's actually was kind of the focus between, or the bridge from the vodka politics book to the new book was based just on that. So I would go every once in a while to these conferences in Russia, and they asked me. This was 2014, 2015, somewhere around there, and these associates asked me to give like the keynote presentation in Russian to this big conference in Russia on alcohol and alcoholism, and so I did that. It kind of I made it through this thing, and I thought they were going to hate me. I thought, I'm airing out their dirty laundry. So, nobody wants that, right? To have to be lectured, especially by a foreigner who's going to come in here and say, you know what your problem is? Let me tell you what your problem is, right? It's that your problem with alcoholism isn't some inherited genetic trait. It's because, the first the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Empire that succeeded it, got 1/4 to 1/3 of all their revenues from the sale of alcohol, right? And I thought they were just going to, tar and feather me after that. And but they were very, very amicable. All these professional historians and social scientists and everything, and historians. They were all like, they said to me, "Yeah, that's true. But so what?" I was like, "Well, what do you mean, so what?" And they said, "Well, every empire did that. Every empire, before modern day income taxes had these huge, chunks of their budgets that were, derived from the sale of alcohol." And that was kind of the turning point. I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, let me investigate that." Right. So that became the starting point of the next book, was to focus in on that revenue extraction. And so yeah, if you look at all these different countries around the globe, including the United States, before income taxes, it was a good 1/4 of American revenue to the federal government came from selling alcohol, and it has always been that way. And so that was, if you go back to the founding of the United States, you had the um, this is kind of one of these little bits of historical trivia, when it came to like, well, what was the first thing, back in 1789, like the first act of Congress? Well, the first act was, pass the Bill of Rights. That was kind of, pro forma, I suppose. But then after that, it was to try to establish a good financial footing for the new government, because we had those Articles of Confederation. Those things fell apart because nobody wanted to pay their fair share. And the thing that was, you know, debated most, I guess, vehemently about that was the idea of having an alcohol not just a tariff like on imported alcohol, which had always been, there since time immemorial. And to answer your question, I think even back then, the argument was that this is an item of commerce that has a negative aspect to it, right? That can cause social harms. And so, even people who were as, sort of liberal in terms of their economic predispositions, in terms of sort of Adam Smith Wealth of Nations type liberal, right? So
in a classically
yeah,
liberal sense. Yeah.
yeah, classical liberal sense in terms of the economics. Even they couldn't, argue that there was some benefit to be had from, from imposing a duty, because who knows, maybe, making something a little bit more dear economically would reduce the consumption of that good, and that would be a benefit, right? And so you have,
in some ways like a sumptuary tax,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Taxing, right.
And so even the founding fathers are like, yeah, this is okay, we can do this. But the transition from like sort of a tariff on imported goods to having a tax on sort of domestically made alcohol, that's what gave us the whiskey rebellion, 1894, out in western areas of Pennsylvania, where you had people up in arms at the idea of, you're going to tax this thing. It's not just an import thing, it's actually a tax on this particular thing. And so that became a big issue in terms of American domestic politics. And I guess the broader issue here, and whether we're talking about American domestic politics or international politics, that kind of motivates my own approach to a lot of this, is that the longer that you spend in this area of studying for alcohol and alcohol control politics, you start to recognize like how much, especially in recent decades, we just kind of bracket that. We say, oh, this is alcohol history, and isn't that quaint, and we can kind of put that over here on the shelf and study it and stuff like that. But it's really not. I mean, it's the more you get into this, the more you start to recognize that, oh, alcohol politics is politics, right?
And
It's
I think your book does a fantastic job of bringing that recognition to the reader, right? So that's what I'm saying that I found most
yeah.
interesting about the book, is that this alcohol politics, as you call it, or the history of alcohol, isn't
Mhm.
just some sort of curiosity on the peripheral edges of history. No, it's actually quite central to
Yeah.
the rise, and in some cases the fall of many modern states, modern Western states especially.
Mhm.
You talk about the whiskey rebellion, and that was an event fundamental to the infancy of this nation, where you had Alexander Hamilton, right? You said one of our founding
Mhm.
fathers, one of our most esteemed founding fathers, devising all these schemes to raise the necessary funds to get this federal government on a sound footing, after assuming all the debts of the states, and like we said, getting together the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And so what does he do? You impose a tax on that which is ubiquitously consumed and sold and cultivated in this country. That's
Mhm.
whiskey. And of course, there was a rather hostile response in Western Pennsylvania to this. But again, just emphasizing the centrality of alcohol. I mean, like you said, just one of the very first taxes to which our domestic population was subjected. So, to those of you listening, I think better to recognize that fact. You need to read a work like yours that really that fleshes that idea out and brings it into stark relief.
And it's fascinating. Like if you go back in and just not rely on like more contemporary history books, but if you read like history books that were written, about American history, say, before 1900, that were published 100 years ago, it's amazing how frequently they talk about, sort of alcohol or alcohol control issues, just as part of the discourse, right? As just, it's not something that is esoteric. It's not something that can be bracketed off and put over here and admired from a distance. No, it was integral to the entire thing, and everybody seemed to appreciate that. And I think maybe that's, I don't want to say it's an indictment of more modern histories, but that we've kind of lost that we start to compartmentalize all sorts of different things, and say, well, I'm going to study, tariff history, or I'm going to study nation nation building or empire building or whatever it is. So we start to bracket ourselves off into all these little components and these little tiny fields of study, and we start to not be able to see sort of the things that connect them in many ways in terms of not only domestic history, but certainly you see this when it comes to international histories as well. Everybody has their specialty. I do, like I said, Russian politics and whatnot. And I talk about this more broadly as I always refer to it as sandboxes. Like people don't like, especially like professional historians, don't like it when you play in their sandbox, right? And so everybody's very territorial. Political scientists don't like it when economists play in their sandbox, and historians don't like it when political scientists play in their sandbox, right? So there's a lot of sandboxism, right, going on, and so yeah, it makes it very hard to do like a big sort of multinational, it's kind of research project, because everybody has those suspicions, right? So if this book has a lot of not only the stuff in Russia where I'm comfortable, that's my sandbox, but I'm also getting into other people's sandboxes, and of course I'm going to screw some stuff up.
Oh,
I'm sure I'm not.
You certainly exceed the boundaries of your prescribed
Yeah.
sandbox. But I think that's a wonderful approach, and
Mhm.
I also think that in some instances, political scientists make more than adequate historians, and that historians likewise are often very incisive political scientists. I think the overlap of those two fields, especially, is obvious, and that sometimes one playing in another's sandbox is quite useful for the reader who's observing everything, I suppose, from
Yeah.
afar.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to do it well. Unfortunately, I think there are those the territoriality that comes of it, and those disciplinary boundaries that people are very, very suspicious of one another. And sometimes folks get it right, sometimes they get it wrong in predictably bad ways. I think um, the usual indictment against political scientists, from a historian's perspective, is that you lose that sort of the insightful approaches of having that sort of mastery of history. And political scientists will just come in, this is the way it's usually portrayed. They come in with their statistical methods, and they want to crunch numbers and put everything into a regression analysis, and away they go, and focus in on that without seeing the nuance in the history. And so I'm particularly uh, I guess I have some sympathy for that argument, because I do see it happen, quite frequently, that you've got a very sophisticated methodology and you just want to apply it everywhere, but you don't recognize those situations where that methodology is not appropriate for what it is that you're studying. So,
Yeah, and
but it's count.
I think you do an admirable job of synthesizing and harmonizing those two aspects, the more numerical one and the more historical one. And I must say, throughout the course of it, you tell a great story. I mean, you focus on some extraordinary figures about whom we could talk maybe in a few minutes, but they really enliven the tale. What is sometimes a discouraging tale of the state's imposition on its people of these taxes and this desire for them to continually imbibe, which leads me to a term of which I previously had never heard. Actually, two terms, and I think they're so appropriate. And I want to know if you are responsible for their coining. The first one is Alco-Imperialism. Alco-Imperialism, portmanteau, so far as I can tell. In Smashing the Liquor Machine, you introduced this word. Can you describe to us what this means, Alco-Imperialism?
Yeah, I don't think I coined it. I may have picked it up. It's in use in other places, but also it kind of describes the role that alcohol obviously plays in sort of the imperial process, right? The conquest of especially non-European territories, which I guess you can also include, in Ireland as well, as one of the as sort of Britain's first colony. But but yeah, it's interesting to see the way that colonialism is portrayed in different ways, and so one is that of I guess the more benign version of colonialism is just one of movement of populations that people used to be over here and now they're over here, um, and that I think is that's one way of looking at it in terms of colonialism. The other one is one of sort of imperial conquest that one group is over here and now they're over here and they are sort of imposing their military will in those areas. Um, a third one looks at it in terms of sort of the economics and sort of the extractive capacity of sort of core and periphery in kind of a Leninist way, saying that okay, we have this core of states and they have to expand and exploit the periphery and get resources and so on. But what's interesting is, again, we tend not to think of alcohol's role in that because we think of alcohol history as this kind of thing that you can put on a shelf and admire from a distance, right? Um, but what was fascinating from like doing this broader comparative analysis is that you start to see the role that alcohol plays in colonization, and it seems to follow the same, um, roughly the same playbook. Whether you're talking about the Belgians in the Congo, or if you're talking about the British in South Africa, or the British in North America, or the British in Australia, or the British in China with I guess the opium trade. Or in India or wherever it is that you're going, it seemed to be the same sort of playbook in these cases, right? And so first of all, I mean, I guess you can take Africa, I guess, as a broad example, because you have different European colonists coming into obviously this huge territory, and you have these white European colonists who are, nominally a lot of them are explorers, but also they're traders, right? They have things that they want to trade with native populations, and those native populations have resources that the European colonists want, right? So you can think about, in South Africa, you've got gold and you've got diamonds. Other places you've got, I guess in the Belgian Congo, they've got rubber resources. In North America, you've got, say, with Native American fur traders; those are highly desired commodities. But then even beyond that, you have the labor that you could exploit of indigenous populations, and the land, right? So there's always something to be taken, right? But the way that I thought was particularly interesting, right? So if you're a European trader, right, and you're coming in and you have some wares, and maybe the natives have something that you want, whether that's furs or spices or gold or whatever it is, right? You're going into indigenous populations, um, in all these cases that have no history um, of industrial distillates, right?
Right.
Of liquors. So they don't have rum, they don't have whiskey, they don't have those high potency, highly portable, and highly addictive, um, liquors that are there, right? And so
Right.
maybe
Now,
if you're, yeah, so
yeah,
if
yeah.
you're,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
yeah, no, go ahead.
I was I read a book a few months ago called, I think it was called The Immortality Key. And it talks about the fact that alcohol, and in some cases, psychedelic substances, are almost co-eval with humankind. So throughout the course of our species history, we've been consuming alcoholic beverages in one form or another, but it was never in this industrialized, highly potent,
Mhm.
highly inebriating way. And you speak to that very eloquently in your book, that these native populations, it's not as though they had no experience with alcoholic beverages, because all it takes is the fermentation of
Mhm.
some local crop, whatever it is, be it rice, be it sugar, be it wheat, whatever it is, to produce an alcoholic libation. But it was this very high, powerful beverage with which they had no prior experience that
Mhm.
led them to these completely immiserated and inebriated states.
Right. And it's, it's the difference between fermentation and distillation. There's this historian, David Christian, who, nowadays I think he does this so-called big history thing. He's kind of a big wig in the big history world, but he started out as a Russian alcohol historian, as it turns out. But he always had this great line that he talks about, like the jump from fermented beverages like wines and beers, meads, ales, kvass if you're in Eastern Europe. Um, these mildly fermented drinks, and then moving to industrial distillates is kind of like the movement of warfare, like to the invention of, or the discovery and utilization of gunpowder, right? You're moving from, bows
From
and
a bow and
arrows
arrow,
to
yes, from a bow
guns,
and
right?
arrow to a gun.
Um, which is to say that now have a new technology of a potency that's far beyond anything domestic, that indigenous populations could utilize. And so, yeah, so some populations like, India, for instance, had palm, natively fermented palm wines and stuff like that. Other areas of Africa didn't even have that. North America apparently had none of that. But across the board, what was interesting was the same sort of trader dynamic, right? So if you're a European trader and you're coming into this native population, who, by the way, have been getting along just fine without you for hundreds, if not thousands of years, well, what do you have to trade with them, right? So if you have a blanket, you could have blankets that you could trade with natives, or a pot, like an iron pot, that would be, that would be something that you could trade with them, but they would be good for that. So if you trade a pot for them, that could last them another 20 to 50 years. They don't need you for another 20 to 50 years, right? So you're not exactly important to their sort of native, I guess, trading routine. But if you bring in whiskey or rum of this high potency and highly addictive thing that they cannot themselves produce, suddenly you've gone from being just, this bit player. Now you're an indispensable part of that local community, right? You are the purveyor of this thing because it has self-fulfilling and self-renewing demand that's associated with it.
It's
So by
devilishly lucrative, and it's
incredibly,
ingenious in a nefarious way.
yeah,
But
yeah.
as one trying to maximize profits, there could be no greater commodity. Even today, I mean, you look at the alcohol companies today, and yes, their profit is dependent on our dependency.
Right, right. And so, all sorts of different things, in terms of alcohol, in terms of, in terms of drugs, or even other things that are highly addictive, right? So like gambling, obviously there's that's been the other thing. If you're looking for like domestic, I guess, contemporary analogies, looking at highly addictive behaviors, it's hard to make a parallel with, modern day temperance or modern day, liquor, I guess the opioid epidemic, and having,
Mhm.
Purdue Pharmaceuticals making money hand over fist at getting people addicted to opioids, and then just, sucking them dry. That's one thing I think, to be sure. But also, if you start looking at, some of these ballot initiatives that we've had recently when it comes to, when it comes to sports betting, sports books, those are other behaviors that can be very, very lucrative, but also, utterly revolve around people, I guess they're addictive qualities as well. So it's weird
Yeah,
to find all these kind of continuities.
yeah, that's a fascinating parallel, and maybe a subject into which your um, academic curiosities will lead you. The history of gambling, and
Mhm.
as a form. I don't know if that was or could be used as a form of state control, or really a way to raise a lot of revenue. I suppose it could be, but it is an interesting modern parallel to draw.
Yeah, yeah, and it's one of those things where you have the state regulation of, there obviously there were lotteries and there have been gambling, for ages, but to harness that into the power of the state and have that be something that financially benefits the state at the expense of society, is yeah, there are a lot of interesting parallels there as well, right? So even listening to the radio locally, right? You have all these, advertisements. It's striking how many advertisements you have for, different casinos, different, sports books, sports book operations. And of course they have to have, like, at the end of every commercial, if you have a problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER, right? That's, kind of, it has to be part of that because it's part of the regulated aspects of this broader trade that does bring in a lot of money to the state, to each individual, sort of United States here in Pennsylvania and, New Jersey and other areas around here. But also comes with some strings attached, comes with, some regulations of the state to modify that behavior.
Yeah, it's one of those moral gray zones
Yeah,
with
yeah,
which a state and its people needs to grapple. I don't know if they always do so successfully. Now,
right.
now you listed a few European actors who imposed this alcoholization on underdeveloped nations, either in Africa or in Asia. Who do you think was the worst offender of this process?
I don't know how, the Belgians weren't particularly great in the Belgian, in King, if you've read King Leopold's Ghost, and, uh, that was kind of part and parcel of their, I guess, colonization of the Congo. But, the British, I mean, the British have used the same sort of, again, this sort of alco colonization, in all sorts of different places, right? So not only when it comes to, South Africa, but also North America, but also India. It seems like they were doing it all over the place. And so,
Mhm.
but when you ask if I'd coined that phrase, I don't know if I'd use that phrase. I probably picked it up at some point. But I do remember reading somewhere, yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head where which source it came from. But they were talking about, like, the British East India Company, as the world's first narco empire, right? Like an entire empire that was built based upon the narcotics trade, right? And so not only talking about what that looked like in India, but also, running opium to China, and using that as a way to sort of dominate and subordinate the Chinese population, by using opium in that particular case, where they might use alcohol in South Africa or in India or in North
Yeah,
America for that.
it's really quite the image to to bring to mind Queen Elizabeth, let's say the late Queen Elizabeth, sitting atop a narco empire whose
Yeah, yeah,
whose grandeur is built on the dependency of masses of indigenous and indigent people
yeah.
across the world. I think I'm not sure if it was in your book that I first encountered that idea. Um, but you certainly speak to that, and it's always startling to me to realize that the British Empire, of which we here in America are the byproducts in
Yeah,
some way,
to be sure.
was basically the fruit of a field sown with narcotics, and whether they were opiates or alcohol or what have you. And you
Mhm.
mentioned Belgium. I feel like Belgium, perhaps because of its size and maybe relative insignificance in the world, has escaped a lot of moral or modern opprobrium. I feel like they, and you make this clear in your book, I feel like they, or at least King Leopold under his administration, um, visited such horrible suffering on on the people of the Congo, and you know of it from, like you said, that work of which you made mention, and of course the Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. But I didn't
Right.
I, I didn't appreciate the alcohol component until I read your book. Their use of, what was it? Their use of gin and the introduction of gin to the local people. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, yeah. The Belgians were heavy on the gin, that's for sure. And of
Yeah.
course, it wasn't just gin, right? And it wasn't just the Belgians, but that was part of, King Leopold wanted to have his colony to be a good, upstanding, European. You had to have a colony, right? And so part of it was the negotiations of, can I have this territory? Will the rest of Europe acknowledge that this is my territory, including, the Belgian people, separate from from the king himself, will everybody recognize that I have, sovereignty over this territory if I let them continue to trade in these areas. And so, if I still allow French traders and German traders into these areas, that was kind of the deal that he had to broker in order to get that sort of international or European recognition of his sovereignty over those populations in the Congo.
You may or may not know the answer to this question. I'll pose it regardless. Do you know, as a consequence of the presence of, say, the Belgians in the Congo and the Germans in, West Africa, southern West Africa, the British in the southern part of Africa, the French in the northern part of Africa, do you know that because of their presences, is there a tradition in these countries today, in these African nations today, these sovereign African nations, a tradition of imbibing drinks from their colonial past? Like, is there a preference for thick German lagers in Western Africa, and maybe certain types of wine in Morocco? Do you know that?
I don't offhand. You can see some of the legacies, and I do write a little bit about this in the book about like South Africa, in particular, where you get. Well, I think it's interesting that you have, Diageo, which is one of the world's biggest alcohol conglomerates. It comes out of, the South African Brewing Company, and so you had, sort of the first industries in South Africa. You had beers, which were being brewed predominantly for the white population, but you had, the first, I guess, liquor, sort of distilleries were the first factories that were in the entire continent of Africa, were there to distill hard liquors, essentially to placate the Native African population, so that you had something that you could get these Native Africans hooked on, so that you could then extract their labor as a resource to make sure that they're the ones who are going down into the gold mines and the diamond mines to pick out those resources that are going to make you rich in that particular case, based upon their labor in that aspect. So in all these cases, it becomes a facilitator of that broader, I guess, colonial dynamic of subjugation in many ways.
In some ways, it's something of a reversal of what we see today. Whereas you consider a beer, perhaps, sort of the the blue collar drink, something that for which you reach at the end of a long day on the after your shift on the in the steel mill or something like that. Whereas the liquors, the spirits, the distilled beverages are more expensive. They're usually consumed in smaller quantities and you sometimes mixed, but back then in the 19th century, it was the reverse. It was these distilled, so far as I understand it, these distilled beverages were the ones disseminated to the people, to the working people, to the subjugated classes, whereas the beers were the privilege of the elite and the wealthy. Do I have that correct?
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, even in Europe, the distilled beverages were seen as, I guess, in the language that they would use, this Marxists would use, sort of the lumpen proletariat, right? That was the beer was it was a good hearty drink for the working class, right? And then, but distilled liquors, I guess the penny schnapps, as they were talking about it, right? That was for the irredeemable drunkards, those guys who were in the gutter. That was the source of their misery. It was also the source of how, I guess, the capitalists were exploiting those, not only the workers, but also those those who were in the gutter, I suppose, in those cases, right? So so the idea was that, having a temperance movement, to try to move people away from, the heavy liquors, towards something that was a little bit more moderate, something that was more acceptable. Social drinking, in the beer halls of Germany, for instance, was seen as, that was there to slake the thirst of the working class. Whereas, the hard liquors were there for the irredeemable drunkards at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating the way in which that has changed throughout the course of the years. So we mentioned a few times the temperance movement.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about its origins and how the idea of prohibition came about?
But talking about temperance is weird, like as I mentioned before, because we do kind of see that in American history as being um, as being a as being the villains, right? You know, those are the ones who are wanted to take away your freedom, right? But one of the interesting things that that has kind of come of this entire movement is that we kind of see the beginnings. The way that temperance is usually taught to us is that it was, you know, tends to be wrapped up in the suffragist movement, which it certainly was. Um, but you can trace it back to these the so-called the six sermons on intemperance of Lyman Beecher in Boston in the 1820s in particular, right? And his argument, it's not like intemperance was something that was new, something that was novel at that point in time. But what he gave to us was this idea that it wasn't just about Bible thumping, right? That drunkards are going to be condemned to hell and fire and brimstone and all that sort of stuff. But where the modern temperance movement comes from and has its overlaps with prohibitionism was a focus on the drink cellar. This is what I found was particularly fascinating. You go back and read his six sermons on intemperance. He wasn't about Bible thumping against the drinker. He was Bible thumping against the drink seller, saying that it's if you want to be a good Christian, you should not be exploiting your neighbor. You should not be forcing your neighbor to drink for your own personal profit. And so that's kind of where it starts to come into its own. Um, but one of the critiques, I think, of our usual historical focus on sort of the origins of temperance is that for so long it has been what I talk about is it only becomes important when it becomes white people's politics, right? So when you start to have white people involved in it, right? And so what's fascinating about taking sort of this global tour and saying, hey, temperance wasn't just about about white evangelical Protestants saying what you can and can't drink, but it tends to be a movement against sort of that alco colonization or Alco-Imperialism of the rest of the world. And so when you start to see that, see it through that particular lens, is you start to recognize, hey, the first temperance members, if you will, were America's first peoples, were Native Americans. And they were very, very clear from the early colonization that they did not want to have what they talked about as, the white man's wicked water being instituted, because they saw, the impacts of this on their local tribes, on their local communities, that you had sort of this domination and subordination of excuse me, Native American populations, um, especially up and down the East Coast, right? When it first came to their first encounters with, uh, you know, European colonists and the alcohols, industrialized alcohols that they were bringing,
Going all
they
the way
saw that.
back, going all the way back to the esteemed Henry Hudson, after whom the Hudson River is named. And I think you mentioned, I won't ask you to translate it in the original Native American tongue, but the very name Manhattan, the city
Yeah,
in which all of our commerce
Manahatachuk,
is
right?
situated. Do you know it? You can pronounce
Yeah,
it,
yeah. I think it was Manahatachuk was
and
the
it
original name.
means and it
It,
means
it it just means the place where we all got drunk.
Right, precisely.
So,
So, for those of you listening, I found that, I mean, just one of those little gems of the book that I found particularly fascinating. The name of the city, Manhattan, comes from originally um, a Native American dialect. I'm not sure whose, but it means essentially the land where they got us drunk, or we were drunk, yeah, or at
right,
least
right.
produced the drink.
Just all those interesting little vignettes, and you start to see how, again, how it's the story of alcohol isn't just something that you can put on the shelf and segregate, but it's the story of America, and it's the story of global history in that same sort of way. And that was, for me, that was what was fun about writing this book, right? Was making those sorts of connections and saying, oh, okay, there's, the history is not just American history, but it's global history. Is sort of this history of drink and sort of the alcohol industry, and the states that kind of profit from it, and sort of the pushback against that. So
And I
this
think
is
that
quite a deep history.
yeah, I think that thread is beautifully woven through the
Mhm.
course of the work. Yeah, and you speak of things on your shelf, putting that on your shelf. You were
Yeah,
speaking metaphorically, but now I'm going to speak just briefly in the, the small amount of time that we have remaining to us.
yeah.
That which occupies your shelf, I would be remiss if I didn't make mention of it. So, listed first among your professional credentials on your Twitter bio is typewriter repairman.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
so,
just a
so
fun.
yeah. So tell me, where does this affinity for typewriters come from? How did you develop this archaic evocation?
I don't know. It's just I picked one up one day because I wanted to like something that was not just clacking away on a laptop, right? And there was something tactile. You get the fun tactile feel, and so I had one. Actually, it was this one over here. This Remington 5, and it's objectively it's a gorgeous piece of art, right? But it also has a function to it, and so you can have those types of things. And then of course one comes to another, right? It's like, oh, you had one, and then you end up having two, and you
They
like the
begin
different feels.
they begin to multiply like rabbits. Yeah,
Yeah, they do. But I'm really fascinated by the early history, because if you go back to from the 1870s through about World War One, like every inventor, every machinist out there, every engineer, everybody had their own idea about how to get an idea out of your head and then through your fingers and put that idea onto a piece of paper, right? And so everybody had they had these wild contraptions, and they were all trying to get to the market, about how they could come up with these different writing machines and what could be done conceivably to have sort of the writing in plain sight, and everybody had all these different uh, these different ways of going about it, before later on they became standardized by the Underwoods and the Royals and the Smith Coronas of the world. But that's what I find utterly fascinating is finding these contraptions, these writing machines, that are still, and again, these are things that I still use. I grade papers on them, and so in
So
many
that was
cases.
my next question. As someone
Yeah.
whose income is dependent on ideas, writing, grading, producing thoughts on paper, do you actually make use of these devices?
Oh yeah, I do. I can't. I don't write the books on them, right? That would be next to impossible, I think.
I was
To go
hoping you
through
would,
all those
because
different things.
it's a quite not to dissuade anyone from reading it, but it's a
Yeah,
quite
yeah.
long book. It's a
It's a
very
long
enjoyable
book.
but a long book. So as soon as I turned on this computer,
Yeah, yeah.
this MacBook, which is far less impressive than any of your typewriters there, but as soon as I saw the image of your background, I just pictured you tapping out 500, 600 pages
Yeah.
on a typewriter.
No, I couldn't do that, but I do use it. I use it for grading, for grading papers. And because it's fun, it has that tactile sense to it, right? And so it allows you to get out frustrations, and it's got a nice clickety clack to it,
And
uh,
it probably makes what could be a tedious task, grading papers, a bit more interactive for you and a bit more stimulating
that's
as you both
exactly
work
it.
on your typewriter and plan to repair it after it
Yeah. You
inevitably
took the exact words
fails.
out of my mouth. It takes, especially when it comes to like grading papers or something, like the most awful sort of most, the dull drudgery of this job, and it actually makes it kind of enjoyable, right? And so it takes like some of these tasks and kind of mixes it up a little bit. It's fun to see students who are like, oh, what is this? How do you, you know, how did you get I had students who come in and look around. They're like, oh, that's how you get those markings on our papers. I'm like, yeah, it's a typewriter. It's not rocket science, but
Yeah.
but it's fun. It's
Now,
something that kind of.
here's the question. Have you prevailed on any of your fellow faculty members to adopt the use of a typewriter?
I have. I've tried. I have not succeeded yet.
It sounds like
So
you could probably start a little cottage industry because you
Oh,
are the
sure.
sole repairman
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the typewriters. So you could actually exploit your your colleagues,
yeah.
give them the typewriters that might be programmed to fail, and then you go in and fix them.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I actually have had some. Well, I guess the one that's sitting right behind the computer here is a Blickensderfer from the 1890s. This weird little thing. It's like only 5 pounds, a very small contraption. And I did have some guy who found me online, and his daughter is a student here at Villanova. And he's like, "Do you have any experience fixing these things?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I've fixed up a couple here and there." And so next thing you know, he's driving down from Connecticut to drop off a typewriter, and has me work on it for a while, and that was fun. It's fun, to kind of bring these things back to life. I mean, it's kind of like this Frankenstein moment that like, it's working now again, right? And there is, I don't know. I think there's always kind of a sense of, I always try to preserve the stories along with them, right? Trying to figure out, oh, who owned this originally, and what were their stories, and who was using this originally, who bought these things, and so like, a lot of these have stories, that kind of come with them. One of my favorite ones, there's a Continental over there. A lot of these were, sort of, especially for World War II, they were, war booty, right? So people would, GIs would take that, was, like the thing that you would get, right? And you would bring it home. And so it's amazing how many German typewriters or Nazi era typewriters kind of wash up in the United States. And
Not
I kind of have,
exactly, not exactly the
yeah.
easiest thing to throw into your pack and
Oh, yeah,
travel
yeah.
back to
Uh,
America.
the portable ones are much easier, right? But the Continental over there, and again, the sort of Nazi era typewriters, I kind of keep at arm's length for a long time. But that was a fascinating one. I bought it from the granddaughter of the GI who brought it from the United States, and he said they had the entire experience, and he said, okay, this was part of the German war machine. This was from Nuremberg, this Wehrkreis 13, which is like their domestic military organization, right? So, and that's where it came from. It was part of that thing. But then, as part of the occupying forces, when they decided that they were going to have the military tribunal and move it from Berlin, which is where it was scheduled to be, to Nuremberg to have the war crimes tribunal, they didn't have enough office machinery, and so they're like, "We need to use your typewriter for this." And so it was kind of drafted into service, and so that typewriter was actually used at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. And so, as somebody who teaches a lot about international history and international law, is like, that has to be part of it. I will hold on to that one just based upon the history that kind of comes
Oh,
through it.
there's a rich history flowing through that machine.
Oh,
That
yeah.
is incredible.
Yeah, there's so many, and all of them. I try to preserve that as best as I can, when it comes to maintaining and preserving some of these machines. But
So if anyone out there is in the need of any typewriter repairman's
yeah,
services, of which you'll
we're
be hard,
around. There are folks in Florida, at Tampa
they can be,
Typewriter.
they can be found. They can
In
be found.
Nashville and Philly. Also, you got people. There's a grassroots movement all over the world that are involved in this, and I can't explain what drives people to this kind of madness, but it's
No,
I
I
find it
wouldn't.
fascinating
I
myself.
wouldn't call it
Right.
madness. There's a certain nostalgia, even if that's not
Yep.
something with which you grew up. There
Yep.
is a sort of a yearning for the simplicity of a bygone time. The
Yep.
same thing is applicable to um, the records, and
Oh,
people are
sure.
buying them. And I'm sure that you have a record. There it is.
Well, I got two of them, stacked on top of each other
Right,
there.
right. So there's a renewed interest in an enthusiasm around
Yep.
these record players, even among people in my demographic who have no experience with these things. But
Oh, yeah, yeah.
there's something, like you said. I think it's that tactility. It's that ability to touch and to feel and to get the energy from past ages and into your system. And I think
Yep.
that's what's driving a lot of this. So you've been
I got
very
the
generous.
LPs over there, and this is all 78s underneath this. This is
Oh, I'd love to see your music. I'd love to
Victrola.
see your music. I'd love to see your music collection. I would
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely love
Well,
to.
I used to work at a record store back in the day, and so that's where I met my wife originally. We used to sell record albums and and CDs and all that other stuff as well. So
So that leads me to a few rapid fire questions. The first of which is, what is your most cherished record? Your most cherished album?
Yeah, my most cherished record album. I don't know. When I was living in Russia in the '90s, I did buy off this guy. He had his entire collection of Beatles albums, but they were all on Soviet vinyl, and I think that was like the coolest thing that I could find. And so I've got like an entire collection of Soviet Beatles record albums. That's probably the most cherished one at this point.
That is very cool. Next, and we're going very quickly, your favorite character from the Russian Revolution, your favorite figure. Who is the most fascinating for you?
From the Russian Revolution, I don't know. I think you got to go with the Lenins and the Trotskys. Those are kind of interesting figures. But one guy, I don't know if I got one of them down here. There's this guy Gustav Gerlach, who was the provider of advanced machines and typewriters to the Imperial Russian Army. I've got one of his machines down here. I'm fascinated by him. Obviously, I'm probably the only one who has any idea who that guy was.
Yeah, I think so. When you said you have him down here, I thought maybe you had him in a mausoleum, but
no, I've got a typewriter of his down here, right?
Okay.
So, what are these machines?
I'm partial to Trotsky. I just I find the way in which he ended, or he was ended, is just one of the great deaths in all of human history. Your favorite alcoholic beverage?
You know what? I've been sober like 6 months now, which is weird, But before then, I was into meads. After the vodka book, I couldn't drink vodka anymore, and I kind of got away from distilled beverages. And so lately, I was on sort of a mead kick. But also, I like a good beer. Like Belgian beers are a lot of fun too. So,
and are there any moral reservations when you imbibe a Belgian beer? When you think back to its colonial abuses, or do you drink it with beer conscience?
Not really, So it's the Belgian beers are like American done Belgian beers. I think are tend to be very, very good. Omegang, there's a brewery up in upstate New York that does. Arguably, they do Belgian beers better than the Belgians, but that I'm sure that's going to get me in trouble with somebody somewhere.
If anyone's listening, then perhaps. But I think you'll be forgiven based on all the wealth of information that you've shared with us. So again, Professor Schrad, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time, for which I thank you. All of your books will be posted in the show notes below, so everyone will have the opportunity to access them and hopefully buy them, as I did, either at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. I think they're available at all your traditional booksellers. And is there a certain social media page or a website on which people can follow you and get some updates on what you're doing, either professionally or with your typewriters?
I'm at Vodka Politics on Twitter. I've kind of mothballed that recently, but I just started up on Instagram. I think it's just at Mark Lawrence Schrad. You can find me there. I'm just posting typewriter pictures for the most part. So
typewriters and busts of Karl Marx. That's a winning combination. Yeah. Well, any parting thoughts from you to our listeners?
No. Not really. Just think broadly. That's kind of my focus. So thinking outside the box in terms of, and don't be afraid to get into other people's, sandboxes. That's where a lot of the fun it tends to be.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice with which we can all walk away. So again, thank you so much for your time, and to everyone out there listening, farewell from Fetterman's wake.